The impact arrives first, before the sound, before any Japanese soldier can process what is happening. On the 4th of May, 1945, in the hills of Okinawa, the 32nd Imperial Japanese Army commits a fatal error. For the first time since the campaign began, Japanese artillery batteries leave their entrenched positions and move into open ground to support a desperate counteroffensive. The Japanese gunners are confident. They fire 13,000 shells at American lines. But the moment the Japanese guns reveal their positions, something happens that defies all military logic known until then. Within minutes, dozens of Japanese artillery pieces simply cease to exist. There is no warning. There is no miscalculation. The Americans respond with surgical precision that seems impossible. American counter-battery fire not only neutralizes Japanese positions but eliminates them systematically, one by one, as if someone were watching every enemy movement in real time. The Japanese attack fails miserably. Survivors retreat to their caves, and among Japanese staff officers, a question begins to circulate. How do the Americans know exactly where we are? If you've made it this far, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving your like. This helps the algorithm deliver this content to more people passionate about military history. The answer to that question did not involve spies hidden in the hills of Okinawa. There were no infiltrated agents transmitting coordinates via radio. What the Japanese faced was something far more revolutionary. A completely new system for conducting artillery operations developed on the plains of Oklahoma in the United States that would forever transform the way wars were fought. To understand how the Americans achieved such an overwhelming advantage, we need to go back almost 2 decades to an unlikely place called Fort Sill. In the early 20th century, American artillery officers rarely had the opportunity to train under realistic conditions, and when they did train, they never practiced what we call massed fire or other advanced techniques. President Theodore Roosevelt, always attentive to the country's military deficiencies, sent Captain Dan T. Moore to observe training at European artillery schools. Moore returned impressed with the German model. Based on his favorable report about the German artillery school, the War Department decided to open a similar school on American soil. Moore was dispatched to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in 1910 to organize the School of Fire for field artillery. This school would train officers and non-commissioned officers in the most modern techniques of the era. After the United States entered World War I, the school reopened in 1917 with Colonel William J. Snow as commandant. The Field Artillery School, as it became known, added more courses over the years. After the war, school commanders initiated a long-term program to improve the mobility, accuracy, and equipment of field artillery. Budget cuts during the 1920s hampered their efforts, but innovative directors of the gunnery department, with support from school commanders, helped modernize field artillery in the 1930s. It was during this period that the first major innovation emerged. Major Carlos Brewer, director of the gunnery department in the late 1920s and early 1930s, introduced new fire direction techniques so that fire support would be more responsive to battlefield needs. Brewer realized that the fundamental problem of artillery was not the power of the guns or the quality of the ammunition. The problem was time. How long did it take to transform a request for fire support into shells hitting the target? In most armies of the era, this process was painfully slow. Brewer began working on solutions, but it was his successor, Major Orlando Ward, who took the decisive step. Ward developed the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. The idea was revolutionary in its simplicity: centralized command and control of artillery operations at a single point, facilitating massing fire, that is, the massive concentration of fire from multiple batteries on a single target. Before the FDC, each artillery battery operated relatively independently. Forward observers communicated targets to their own batteries, and each battery calculated firing data separately. The process was slow, uncoordinated, and wasted the destructive potential of artillery. The Fire Direction Center changed everything. The FDC centralized the calculation of firing data within the battalion, allowing gunners to mass fire quickly. Not only that, but it fundamentally changed the role of the artillery battalion. Before, the battalion was just a collection of semi-independent batteries. With the FDC, the battalion became an integrated unit capable of concentrating all its firepower in seconds. The FDC was developed between 1932 and 1934, years before the start of World War II. The battalion FDC was officially adopted in 1941, and that same year, a divisional FDC was demonstrated for the first time. The FDC innovation would prove vital in the Tunisia campaign of 1943. General Omar Bradley observed that the system allowed any forward observer to request fire from all corps' artillery, something around 324 guns and howitzers against a single target. American artillery would prove its value countless times in subsequent campaigns, thanks to excellent training, tactics, and technology. But there was still another problem to be solved. Even with the FDC, firing calculations still consumed precious time. A forward observer might identify a target, but while data were calculated manually, the target could move or disperse. In November 1940, a young captain named Abbott Burns recognized the fundamental problem. The problem was not the mathematics. The ballistic calculations were sound. The firing tables contained accurate data derived from extensive testing. The problem was accessing that data quickly. Consulting values in tables was inherently slow. Burns developed what would become known as the graphical firing table. It was a simple wooden slide rule that would revolutionize American artillery during World War II. Burns adapted the device to calculate ranges for any powder charge and any weapon system. The innovation was tested extensively at Fort Sill. Artillery officers who learned to use the device could calculate firing data more than 20 times faster than traditional methods. And most impressive, enlisted soldiers with basic arithmetic knowledge could make calculations that previously required officers with engineering training. In April 1941, General George Marshall witnessed a firing demonstration with 4 battalions at Fort Sill. Impressed with what he saw, the War Department officially adopted the Fire Direction Center. Every FDC under American command received graphical firing tables. Every artillery officer knew how to use them. Every battery could calculate firing data in less than 30 seconds. For the first time, American artillery had both the firepower and the coordination capability to execute truly devastating missions on a massive scale. A forward observer from one division could request support from the artillery of another division or even from corps-level guns. The system treated all artillery as general support, rather than being rigidly allocated to specific units. This meant unprecedented flexibility. If an observer from the 99th Division spotted a critical target, he could call fire from the artillery of the 2nd Division, the 1st Division, or corps guns simultaneously. No other army in the world had this capability. The integration of aerial observation with the Fire Direction Center system created a level of battlefield situational awareness that was unprecedented. FDCs maintained detailed maps showing friendly unit positions, known enemy positions, suspected enemy locations, and no-fire areas where friendly forces might be present. When an aerial observer reported a target, the FDC could immediately process the information and coordinate fire. But the real secret weapon was something called time on target, or TOT. The sophistication of American fire direction, developed at Fort Sill, included a unique capability at the time, having multiple batteries fire TOT missions, where all shells arrived simultaneously at the target. The FDC coordinating the mission transmitted a countdown to all participating batteries. Each battery calculated the time of flight from their guns to the target. each fired during the countdown at the calculated moment so that initial rounds from all guns impacted the target simultaneously. The effect was devastating. Imagine the scene from the enemy soldier's point of view. One moment, everything is relatively quiet. The next moment, dozens, sometimes hundreds of shells explode at the same time without any prior warning. There is no characteristic sound of approaching shells that normally gave a few seconds to seek cover. There is no time to move equipment or disperse troops. Everything happens at once, in a fraction of a second. After World War II, the Army learned that an artillery barrage produces more casualties in the first seconds before the enemy can seek cover. The time-on-target technique exploited exactly this principle, maximizing enemy casualties by eliminating any chance of reaction. The mathematical precision necessary for this feat would have seemed impossible to artillery officers from any previous war. Each battery had to calculate not just range and deflection, but time of flight. A 105 millimeter howitzer shell fired at high angle might take 23 seconds to reach its target. A 155 millimeter gun firing from farther away might require 31 seconds. Fire commands were staggered backward from the moment of impact, with each battery firing at the precise second calculated to ensure unified arrival. Light 105 millimeter howitzers, medium 155 millimeter guns, heavy 8-inch howitzers, and massive 240 millimeter batteries all contributed to a single devastating moment of impact. It was artillery transformed into exact science. The Germans, who had perfected their own concentrated fire doctrine called Schwerpunkt, focusing overwhelming force at decisive points, could not comprehend how the Americans achieved such precision. German artillery doctrine, refined through victories in Poland, France, and the early stages of the Russian campaign, emphasized rapid concentration and displacement. German forward observers, working in close cooperation with battery commanders, could bring accurate fire on targets within minutes. But even so, they could not match American speed and coordination. In the Hurtgen Forest, the Americans demonstrated that time on target could be devastatingly effective even in dense forest that Germans considered artillery-proof. The Americans developed TOT missions with tree bursts, timing shells to detonate in the tree canopy. In November 1944, the 4th Infantry Division attacking through the forest requested TOT missions using a mix of high explosive and white phosphorus. Fragments and incandescent fire descended on German positions from above, making trenches useless. The systematic destruction of crossing attempts through precisely timed artillery demonstrated the flexibility of the technique. German units began refusing to cross in daylight, creating enormous traffic jams on the west banks of rivers, which became targets for additional TOT missions. By December 1944, the Americans had integrated new technologies that made time on target even more devastating. In the Battle of the Bulge, the ability to mass fire rapidly through TOT proved crucial for containing German penetrations. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces called danger close TOT missions, perilously near their own positions, devastating German assault formations attempting to break through the perimeter. It was in that battle that another American secret weapon entered action on land for the first time, the proximity fuse, known as the VT fuse. General George Patton wrote about it. "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." The proximity fuse, or variable time fuse, was one of the war's most secret innovations. A fuse that detonated automatically when approaching a target at a certain distance, without requiring direct impact. Initially developed for anti-aircraft defense, the proximity fuse used a small radio transmitter that detected changes in reflected signal frequency when near an object. The cruiser USS Cleveland conducted the first test firing of the new proximity fuse in early August 1942 in Chesapeake Bay. It was a success from the start. In November 1942, the Navy sent 5,000 of the new fuses to Pearl Harbor, where the Pacific Fleet received a total of 4,500 units. The war against Japanese dive bombers in the South Pacific would soon change dramatically. Fear that the Japanese might capture unexploded shells containing the fuse restricted its use to open ocean until 1944. But at sea, the results were spectacular. The USS Helena is credited with the first shootdown of an enemy aircraft using a proximity-fused shell. It was a Japanese dive bomber that had just made a bombing attack against the ship on January 6, 1943, off Cape Hunter on the south coast of Guadalcanal. The crew fired 3 shells with little time to aim, but all 3 exploded near the aircraft and brought it down. It took only 30 months for the research committee to accomplish what seemed an impossible task. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded the fast carrier task forces, had all 5-inch .38 caliber and 5-inch .25 caliber ammunition, equipped with VT fuses. These fuses shot down enemy planes by the dozens. If not for these fuses, ship losses and casualties on the fast carriers in the last half of the war would have been enormously greater. The fuse was a magnificent aid, but the terrestrial application of the VT fuse was equally revolutionary. A version was designed for artillery shells for airbursts against enemy ground forces. This was used for the first time very effectively in the Battle of the Bulge. Instead of exploding on impact with the ground, where much of the explosive force was absorbed by the earth, shells now exploded in the air at an ideal height above enemy troops. The rain of fragments was lethal to anything exposed in shallow trenches. The backbone of American artillery was the M2A1 105mm howitzer. It could fire 33-pound shells, approximately 15 kilograms, up to a range of 12,205 yards, with a sustained rate of fire of 2 to 4 rounds per minute. The shell was powerful enough to be 50% lethal within a 20-meter radius. The M2A1 was supported by the M1 155mm howitzer, with a range of 16,000 yards and sustained rate of fire of 2 rounds per minute. An experienced crew could fire 5 rounds per minute in short bursts. Besides high explosive shells, the guns were supplied with hollow charge anti-tank ammunition capable of penetrating approximately 90 millimeters of armor. The diversity of available ammunition gave American gunners flexibility to engage any type of target, from infantry positions to armored vehicles. In the Pacific, American artillery faced unique challenges. Pacific Island terrain was radically different from European battlefields. Dense jungles, mountainous terrain, and deeply entrenched Japanese defenses required tactical adaptations. The Japanese, after early disastrous experiences, had learned to build increasingly sophisticated and well-camouflaged fortifications in depth. As the war progressed, the Japanese built increasingly sophisticated and well-camouflaged fortifications in depth, and the time available for American analysts to research and identify island defenses decreased. Operations were executed in rapid succession, and the pace of the campaign was so fast and intelligence analysis so slow that important information often reached commanders after the battle had already begun. But American artillery adapted. At Guadalcanal, one of the first Pacific ground campaigns, Americans were already employing techniques that confused the Japanese. Marine Corps forward observers climbed trees in the Coley Point area to obtain better battlefield visibility, coordinating artillery fire with deadly precision. The time-on-target technique was used at Guadalcanal with devastating effect. In one operation, all available artillery was coordinated to fire in careful sequence so that all initial shells from any direction and distance landed at the same time, without the usual warning given when rounds from the nearest battery arrived before those from the main concentration, allowing troops in the open to seek cover and move equipment. After that, batteries continued firing into the destruction zone continuously, but at irregular intervals for an extended period, 30 minutes in this case. The technique appeared effective as soldiers advancing later through these zones encountered little resistance. Japanese soldiers found dead in their positions had no small arms wounds. They had been eliminated purely by artillery power. Survivors who were captured spoke of absolute terror, of having no time to react, of not understanding how the Americans knew exactly where to attack. At Okinawa, the last and bloodiest ground battle of the Pacific, American artillery superiority reached its apex. The 32nd Japanese Army staff calculated that the superior quality and quantity of weapons gave each American division 5 or 6 times the firepower of a Japanese division. Added to this was abundant American naval and air firepower. When the Americans launched their offensive on April 19, 1945, they did so with a barrage of 324 guns, the largest in the entire history of the Pacific Ocean theater of operations. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers joined the bombardment, which was followed by 650 Navy and Marine aircraft attacking Japanese positions with napalm, rockets, bombs, and machine guns. Japanese defenses were positioned on reverse slopes where defenders waited out the artillery barrage and air attack in relative safety, emerging from caves to pour mortars and grenades on Americans advancing up the front slope. It was a brilliant defensive tactic that the Japanese had perfected throughout previous campaigns. But on May 4th, General Ushijima made a fatal error. He ordered a counteroffensive, including amphibious landings on the coasts behind American lines. To support his offensive, Japanese artillery had to move into open ground. In doing so, they managed to fire 13,000 shells in support of the operation. But American counter-battery fire was devastating. Dozens of Japanese artillery pieces were eliminated. The attack failed completely. Japanese intelligence officers were stunned. How did the Americans react so quickly? How did they know exactly where each Japanese artillery position was? The answer lay in a combination of technologies and techniques that the Japanese simply did not understand. The Americans used sound ranging and flash detection equipment to identify Japanese guns with precision. When a Japanese battery fired, the muzzle flash was detected by observers positioned at different points. Triangulation gave the exact position. Similarly, the sound of firing was picked up by sensitive microphones, and the time difference between sound arrivals at different points allowed calculation of the location. Observation aircraft flew constantly over enemy lines, reporting movements and positions. And when a position was identified, counter-battery fire was coordinated at corps level. At Okinawa, there were moments when the artillery of an entire corps was directed against just 2 Japanese guns. The concentration of firepower was overwhelming. The Japanese, accustomed to operating with slow communications and limited coordination between units, could not conceive that the Americans could orchestrate such a level of response in so little time. The most logical explanation in their minds was espionage. Someone had to be informing the Americans. There had to be a spy network infiltrated reporting every Japanese movement. The irony was profound. The Japanese, who had maintained extensive espionage networks before the war, could not imagine that American superiority came from something as mundane as mathematics and organization. Before Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built and cultivated intelligence networks on the American continent. Spies like Takeo Yoshikawa had provided detailed information about Pearl Harbor that contributed to the attack's success. But the Americans did not need spies. They had something better, a system that transformed tactical information into deadly fire in a matter of seconds. A forward observer with a radio, a fire direction center with graphical firing tables, and a communications network that connected all available batteries. It was technology, training, and doctrine integrated into an unparalleled combat machine. The human element was crucial in this equation. The men who operated the fire direction centers performed work that would never earn heroism medals, but they saved thousands of American and Allied lives by enabling artillery to suppress enemy forces so effectively that infantry and armor could advance with reduced casualties. And their system eliminated tens of thousands of Axis soldiers who had no effective defense against accurate and coordinated fire. Forward observers were the eyes of this machine. At Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest Pacific battles, Marines faced deadly and accurate Japanese artillery fire. But forward observers on established radio networks helped reduce the threat of enemy fire by directing naval fire and air support against Japanese artillery. An account from a Marine artillery gunner at Iwo Jima captures the intensity. The forward observer was giving us coordinates all day, and at night we fired illumination shells. Coordination between forward observers, FDCs, and batteries was continuous, 24 hours a day. The fire direction center concept spread throughout the American Army and became standard NATO doctrine after the war. What was developed on the Oklahoma plains in the 30s became the worldwide model for modern artillery operations. In the European theater, Germans had an experience similar to the Japanese. German intelligence officers interviewed prisoners and examined captured American positions, trying to understand how fire direction centers could calculate and deliver fire so quickly. General Fritz Bayerlein reported to Field Marshal von Luga his famous assessment: "My front lines look like the face of the moon, and at least 70% of my troops are out of action, dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed." The Germans could not fully comprehend the mathematical precision behind time on target. As American forces approached the Rhine in March 1945, time on target reached its apex of destructive capability. Each attack involved hundreds of guns achieving unified impact across target areas kilometers wide. The scale was unprecedented. In preparation for the crossing, American artillery fired more than 65,000 tons of ammunition in March 1945, alone. German defenders reported that the bombardment was so intense that concussion alone caused casualties, with soldiers found dead without visible wounds. American ammunition also enjoyed an advantage difficult to quantify: superior quality. By 1942, Germany was recruiting workers of questionable quality for its factories, and German ammunition quality suffered. American ammunition, produced in factories with highly trained labor and rigorous quality control, was consistently reliable. The Central Pacific campaigns revealed the complementary strengths and weaknesses of naval, air, and field artillery fire. Naval fire provided consistent and sustained coverage during landing operations, and its high-volume fire capability made it the backbone of American island assaults. As naval fire officers learned and improved from their early experiences in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, naval fire ships positioned themselves increasingly close to shore to provide the most accurate and destructive shots possible to forces fighting ashore. The triple integration of naval, air, and ground artillery, called Triphibious Fire Support, was unique to American forces. No other army in the world had the capability to coordinate three fire elements so effectively. The Japanese, with their limited communications and rigid doctrine, could not adapt to this level of coordination. Lessons from each battle were quickly incorporated into American tactics. After Tarawa, where casualties were high due to insufficient naval bombardment, Americans drastically increased the duration and intensity of pre-invasion bombardments. After the Marianas, where Japanese defenses in depth caused problems, Americans developed new techniques for dealing with bunkers and caves. Flexibility and adaptability were hallmarks of the American military machine. Meanwhile, the Japanese army was trapped in a spiral of declining resources and static defenses. Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive spirit, But Pacific reality forced the Japanese to adopt defensive tactics for which they were not well prepared, and every time they attempted counteroffensives, as at Okinawa, they were massacred by American artillery. Japanese paranoia about American espionage was, in a sense, a tribute to the success of the American system. It was so effective that it seemed impossible without inside information. The Japanese, who had underestimated Americans before the war, now overestimated them in the wrong ways, looking for conspiracies where there was only technical and organizational ingenuity. German prisoners captured in the European theater told similar stories. After being subjected to time-on-target missions, many simply gave up resisting. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. When you cannot predict where the next attack will come from, when there is no time to seek cover, when your entire platoon can be eliminated in a single instant without warning, morale collapses. The Americans understood early that artillery was the greatest killer on the modern battlefield. While other armies still romanticized the infantry charge or the heroic tank, Americans invested in their king of battle. The result was an artillery force that had no equal in the world. The innovations developed at Fort Sill had lasting impact far beyond World War II. The Fire Direction Center concept, graphical firing tables, time on target, all became fundamental elements of Western artillery doctrine. When the Cold War began, these concepts were incorporated into NATO doctrine. In 1946, the War Department consolidated all artillery training and development under the United States Army Artillery Center at Fort Sill. By this time, the center included the Artillery School, the Anti-Aircraft and Guided Missile Artillery School at Fort Bliss, Texas, and the Coast Artillery School at Fort Scott, California. Adaptation to the atomic age and Cold War brought new demands, but the fundamental principles developed by Brewer, Ward, and Burns remained. Centralization of command and control, speed in calculating firing data, coordination of multiple units for massed fire. These principles remain relevant today. The Japanese never developed a comparable system. Their artillery, while technically competent in terms of equipment, never achieved the same level of coordination and flexibility. Japanese doctrine remained decentralized, with batteries operating relatively independently. Communication between units was slow and often unreliable. Part of this was cultural. The Japanese Army valued individual initiative and offensive aggressiveness over meticulous coordination. Japanese officers were trained to attack, not to orchestrate complex fire support. This worked well in initial campaigns against ill-prepared opponents, but against the American military machine, the limitations became fatal. The contrast was particularly evident at Okinawa. The Japanese had positioned heavy guns in mutually supporting locations, deeply entrenched in the same coral ridges where most Japanese infantry were deployed. It was a formidable defensive position. But when Japanese artillery moved into open ground to support the May 4th counteroffensive, the American response was overwhelming. The attempted amphibious landings behind American lines also failed miserably. The Japanese staff concluded after the failure that Americans were vulnerable to nighttime infiltration tactics, but that their superior firepower made any Japanese offensive concentration of troops extremely dangerous. They reverted to their defensive strategy, but the damage was done. The inevitable conclusion for Japanese commanders was that they could not win in conventional combat against the Americans. Their firepower was simply too overwhelming. The only hope was to inflict casualties so heavy that Americans would lose the will to continue fighting. It was a desperate strategy, and Japanese officers knew it. The legacy of American artillery in World War II goes far beyond battle statistics. It represented a fundamentally different approach to warfare, where technology, organization, and training combined to create capabilities that adversaries simply could not match. The Japanese and Germans could have brave soldiers, competent leaders, and quality equipment. But they did not have the system. The system was the real secret weapon. Not a single revolutionary technology, but the integration of many innovations into a coherent whole. Portable radios enabled rapid communication. The Fire Direction Center centralized control. Graphical firing tables accelerated calculations. Time on target synchronized impact. The proximity fuse maximized lethality. Forward observers provided the eyes. Reconnaissance aircraft expanded vision. Each element supported and amplified the others. And at the center of it all was the American soldier, trained, equipped, and organized for a type of warfare that his enemies simply did not understand. When the Japanese attributed American precision to espionage, they were, in a sense, admitting their own inability to conceive such a level of technical and organizational competence. The story of American artillery in World War II is ultimately a story of innovation born from necessity, refined through training, and proven on the battlefield. From the offices of Fort Sill to the jungles of Guadalcanal, from the beaches of Iwo Jima to the hills of Okinawa, American gunners demonstrated that in modern war, it is not just what you have, but how you use it that determines victory. The Japanese never discovered where the American spies were, because there were no spies. There was only mathematics, communication, and coordination taken to a level the world had never seen before. And when shells fell from the sky with impossible precision, when entire batteries were eliminated in seconds, when counteroffensives were destroyed before they even began, the Japanese could only look up in incomprehension and wonder, how do they know? The answer was written in wooden slide rules, in maps covered with annotations, in radios crackling with coordinates, in observers perched in trees, in aircraft circling the battlefield. The answer was the American artillery system, the most lethal and least understood weapon of World War II. A weapon that needed no spies, only well-trained soldiers and well-applied technology. And against that combination, neither Japanese courage nor German discipline had an answer.